Are you in a simulation? Those who believe, are you in a simulation? Do you imagine that what you consider yourself to be is subjected to a simulation, or as being simulated? Is your sense of individuality a result of an external entity's creation, or is it an intrinsic part of the simulation's fabric? These questions probe at the heart of the simulation theory, and more importantly, the nature of selfhood within that context. To ask it another way, are there two of you? Is there the self you know within the simulation and a distinct external self observing or existing outside the simulation? If so, how do these two selves interact, if at all? Does the external self have agency or awareness over the simulated self? Or is the relationship one of detachment, where the external self remains passive and unconnected to the events within the simulation? Or do you think there is only one self which, upon leaving the simulation, would feel identical to, or at least continuous with the self within the simulation? In this perspective, the simulation is a container for the self, but the essence of you remains the same whether inside or outside of it. The experience within the simulation would then be seen as a part of your broader identity, seamlessly integrated into the narrative of your existence. Alternatively, do you consider the entire concept of self to be wholly part of the illusion and only within the simulation? In this framework, the idea of a separate individual self is a construct of the simulation itself, an artifact designed to facilitate interaction within the simulated world. If this is true, then upon leaving the simulation, there would be no you as you currently understand yourself. The sense of individuality might dissolve entirely, leaving behind an awareness that transcends the boundaries of the simulated self. I ask because I have seen a lot of references to Eastern philosophies and discussions about simulation theory. Many of these references lean on concepts like Maya, illusion, or Atman, soul self. Yet they often stop short of fully embracing the idea that the self itself could be entirely illusory. For instance, Zen Buddhism, as far as my limited understanding informs me, seems to align more closely with the last option. It suggests that the self is a construct, not an inherent truth, and that clinging to the idea of self perpetuates suffering and illusion. Let's expand on these possibilities. The dual self hypothesis. This perspective posits that there are two selves, one within the simulation and one outside of it. The simulated self is what we experience in daily life, governed by the rules and limitations of the simulated environment. The external self, on the other hand, exists in a realm beyond the simulation, potentially acting as a player or observer. This view raises questions about the relationship between these two selves. Does the external self guide or influence the simulated self? Are dreams, intuitions, or subconscious thoughts a form of communication between the two? Or is the external self entirely detached, watching without interference? And if the simulation ends, does the external self retain the memories and experiences of the simulated self, or are they lost in the transition? The unified self hypothesis. Here, there is no distinction between the self within the simulation and the self outside of it. The self is singular and continuous, carrying its identity through different states of existence. The simulation, in this case, is just one layer of experience for the unified self. This idea suggests that leaving the simulation would not feel like a rupture, but rather like waking from a vivid dream. The experiences within the simulation would remain meaningful and integrated into the larger story of the self. This view aligns with philosophies that emphasize the continuity of consciousness, and the idea that all experiences, no matter how illusory, contribute to the growth and evolution of the self. The illusory self hypothesis. In this view, the concept of self is entirely a product of the simulation. The self exists only as a construct within the simulated environment, much like a character in a video game. Once the simulation ends, the self dissolves, leaving behind an undifferentiated awareness or nothing at all. This perspective challenges deeply held beliefs about individuality and identity. If the self is an illusion, what remains when it disappears? Is there a broader awareness or consciousness that encompasses all simulated selves, or is the self simply a temporary phenomenon with no enduring essence? This aligns with Zen Buddhist teachings that emphasize the emptiness of self and the importance of transcending egoic identification. Eastern philosophy and simulation theory. Eastern philosophies, particularly Zen Buddhism, offer valuable insights into these questions. Zen teaches that attachment to the self is a source of suffering, and that liberation comes from realizing the illusory nature of individuality. The concept of no self, anatta, suggests that what we perceive as me is a collection of fleeting thoughts, sensations, and experiences with no enduring core. In the context of simulation theory, this could mean that the self we experience is part of the simulation's programming. Our sense of identity is a tool created by the simulation to help us navigate its environment. Recognizing this could lead to a deeper understanding of reality, both within and beyond the simulation. Implications for believers. For those who believe in simulation theory, these questions have profound implications. If there are two selves, what responsibilities do they have to each other? If the self is unified, how do we reconcile experiences within and outside the simulation? And if the self is illusory, what does that mean for our pursuit of meaning and purpose? Ultimately, the answers to these questions depend on how we define selfhood and what we believe lies beyond the simulation. Whether we see the self as dual, unified, or illusory, exploring these ideas can deepen our understanding of existence and our place within it.